That the old man, apparently in his 90s, was still alive was miracle enough. That he was conscious and capable of intelligent speech was, to Grange, shocking. He had been told that when the fire department answered a neighbour's call about smoke billowing from the attic windows of the old man's house, and upon discovering his charred body on the floor, his hair and clothing entirely burned away, they had thought him dead, until he groaned and raked one man's leg with a hand like a blackened bird's claw. "You know the first thing that went through my head?" This firefighter had related to Grange only an hour ago. "Spontaneous human combustion. I know, but I'm telling you, the only thing burned in that attic was this guy. Even the old rug he fell on was barely scorched. There was a greasy kind of soot on the walls, but that came from him. Maybe it was spontaneous human combustion. Just that in his case it didn't entirely do the job." Grange didn't understand medicine, but he knew there must be some good reason the elderly man's face was not entirely swathed in gauze. It had been difficult, upon entering the room, to conceal his revulsion. That hideous mask could not be the countenance of a human being. Grange had been told the body, covered in a sheet at least, was much worse. The frail little man's body barely tented the sheet. George had seen more substantial remains dug out of decades-old shallow graves. "Mr. Brill, I'm Detective Grange," he said, leaning a bit over the bed, expecting the old man's eyes to open. The nurse, before letting him in, had assured him Brill was awake, but when Brill replied, he still did not open his eyes, and Grange queasily wondered if his eyes were fused shut, or if those orbs had turned to gelatin beneath them. "Detective," Brill greeted him. "Sit down. Have I done something wrong?" Taking a seat at the bedside, Grange couldn't prevent himself from chuckling uncomfortably. "Well, setting yourself on fire is wrong, I guess, but I didn't come here to arrest you, just to find out what happened." "I didn't set myself on fire," Brill told him. His voice was both an agonized rasp and weirdly calm. "So it wasn't intentional. That's a good thing. How did it happen? Were you smoking?" "I told you I didn't set myself on fire." Grange took in the man's ruined profile for several beats. He was reminded of the fireman's talk of spontaneous human combustion. Stupid, he scolded himself. The old man was senile. Of course he had set himself ablaze. He might not know he had done it, but done it he surely had. Nevertheless, Grange asked him again. "So, how did it happen?" There was a long pause. Life support equipment hissed. Red numbers fluctuated on monitor screens as if flashing an encoded message. "It was my brother, Martin Brill. He did this to me." "Your brother?" George sat forward. "Where is he? I was told you didn't have any family." "He lives across town, on Pine Street, right on the outside of Eastborough Swamp." "And he set you on fire? Purposely?" A slight nod of a head like that of a peeling, unwrapped mummy, horribly contrasted against the pristine white pillows. "Why?" "We haven't spoken much in years. We had a falling out a long, long time ago. For a while we made up and moved out here to Massachusetts together, but—" a cough painful even to hear. "We have different philosophies." After a moment, Brill amended. "Different religions." "So he came to your house and set you on fire? Where is he now?" "He's home, but he never left his house to do this to me. He sent something else to my house to do it for him." Had the old man meant to say someone else? "Who was that?" he asked, wondering if this story were all a delusion born of pain, delirium, paranoia. Again, just the hissing, the beeping, a rattling cart being pushed past the door. Then, "An elemental, a fire vampire, one of the minions of the god Martin worships." Grange found himself sitting back in his chair, his hands untensing on his knees. Yes, the elderly man was delusional. Yes, he had to have unconsciously immolated himself. No, Grange did not believe that Brill's brother had set him ablaze, with or without the help of any minion. Still, he at least had to talk to this next of kin. At the very least, all feuding aside, he should know that his brother was probably not going to survive. Before Grange sought out this Martin Brill on Pine Street, however, upon returning to Eastborough from the hospital in Worcester, he first stopped at Edgar Brill's own home. He himself had not yet viewed the scene, had only spoken with the men who had sprayed the coal-like smouldering crisp of Brill's body, and the uniformed men who had initially responded to the call. With Brill's own keys, Grange let himself into the now empty old house. That the old man was an eccentric, strange even when he wasn't delirious with pain, was readily apparent. The squalor of the house was bad enough. Filthy clothing strewn about, food-encrusted dishes resting throughout the house, newspapers, magazines and books stacked precariously in each room to the point where some rooms had mere pathways through this landscape of paper mesas and plateaus. But this in itself was not surprising for an elderly person living by himself. It was rather the decor that mystified the small-town detective. One room's ceiling was painted black, for instance. Large eye-hooks had been screwed into the ceiling, and metal wire threaded through them, making a kind of hanging web, from the middle of which dangled an intricate contraption like a box-kite, but much more elaborate, constructed of sticks and paper, that twirled gently in the breeze of Grange's movement. Odd symbols or markings on the various faces of the mobile revealed themselves as it turned in the displaced air. In another room, in amongst an abundance of crumbling ancient books that filled a number of built-in shelves, Grange's eye was drawn to a biological specimen preserved for display in a greenish-tinted block of lucite, or some such substance. The frayed, greyish-pink matter in this block was not even remotely recognizable except as something organic. This wasn't some human organ, was it? On the top he noticed a narrow label, the typed ink very faint on the yellow paper. Grange had to take the object down from the shelf to read it. It read, "St. Augustine, Florida, 1896. Replacing the heavy block, Grange took note of a photograph cut from a book and tacked to the wall beside the bookshelf. A similar typed label was taped across its bottom. It appeared to show some blob-like, rotting carcass washed ashore on a beach, obviously in St. Augustine, Florida. A typed letter was tacked below the photo, and simply read, "Edgar, here is that chunk I alluded to. Methinks it was a spawn of C." Photo enclosed as well. Best S. Sargent. In other rooms, more photographs and cryptic correspondence, and articles clipped from newspapers and magazines such as National Geographic and Fate adorned the walls, sometimes in great profusion, like a kind of patchwork wallpaper. In other rooms, more photographs and cryptic correspondence, and articles clipped from newspapers and magazines such as National Geographic and Fate adorned the walls, sometimes in great profusion, like a kind of patchwork wallpaper. At last Grange mounted a narrow, creaking staircase to the attic, pausing through beams of late afternoon sunlight in which dust motes swarmed, like plankton. The attic, which had once been a third-floor apartment, was more of the same clutter, only worse. The walls had been stripped down to the plaster, but never prepared again except for more clippings. Halfway up the stairs, he paused to read about a family plagued by poltergeist activity, including a profusion of mysterious fires. Just beyond the top of the stairs, Grange paused to read from a lengthy article, very yellowed and crumbling, as it was dated 1971, written on the 100th anniversary of the Great Chicago Fire. Grange had never realized just what a horrific tragedy that had been, or how strangely widespread the fiery devastation had been all on that night of October the 8th, 1871. Tremendous fires had swept through Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and Wisconsin. 24 towns burned to charcoal, 2,000 lives lost. Of these, 1,500 had been lost in a 400-square-mile area of Wisconsin. The town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, suffered the greatest violence, when monstrous windstorms of fire had descended from the sky with biblical fury. One house had been lifted by the hellish winds 100 feet into the air, there to erupt into flame. An eyewitness to the nightmare had written, "In one awful instant, a great flame shot up in the western heavens, and in countless fiery tongues struck downward into the village, piercing every object that stood in the town like a red-hot bolt. The flaming whirlwind swirled in an instant through the town. All heard the first inexplicable roar, while a few avow that the heavens opened and the fire rained down from above." "So much for a cow kicking over a lantern," Grange muttered. He read on, eerie details about the mysterious, often fickle behavior of the blazing tornado. One man had been found dead, but strangely untouched by the fire, and yet some coins in his pocket were partly fused from the heat. And another man was found alive, staggering along in a stupor, his hair and clothes seared away, but an oddly carved musical instrument merged with the hand that clutched it. He had been mumbling repeatedly about something called Cthugha, which he blamed for the conflagration, and spoke of as an entity, leading those who found him to believe he was referring to some Indian god. The man, one Edgar Brill, had ended up in a sanitarium. His mind blasted. Edgar Brill. So that explained the interest of Eastborough's Edgar Brill in this story. His grandfather, perhaps, for whom he had been named? Grange sighed, straightened, barely able to take in the enormity of the horror described. He moved further into the attic, turning into a front room from which emanated a burnt smell. The walls in here were indeed coated in a black soot, but other than that, and the blackened scrap of rug on the floor, fire damage was not apparent. The room was unsettling enough without it. It was a small room with slanted walls, again covered in clippings, most obscured by the soot, but barely scorched. One photo drew Grange closer. It showed a man presenting an object before him in both hands. Was it a carved walking stick? Some primitive club? The end of it was bell-shaped, so Grange concluded it was a musical instrument. The photo was labelled Riggs Lake, Wisconsin. Wisconsin again. Was that, then, the musical instrument that had been fused to the earlier Edgar Brill's hand? If so, the photo was more recent than that. Edgar took in a kind of altar that had been set up at the end of the room, directly before its one window, and remembered what Brill had said about him and his brother practicing opposing religions. What could Edgar Brill's beliefs be to account for this? The window had been masked off with thin black cardboard, from the centre of which had been cut a 5-armed star shape that vaguely had a human-like form. All the sunlight in the room poured through this rough figure, though to either side of it much smaller shapes, cut perhaps with an X-Acto knife, let in a little more light. They were hard to make out. Perhaps many-limbed insects, or squid. Grange removed a cloth from atop the table presumably used as an altar. There was a spiral-bound notebook there, an old leather-bound book written in German, and the musical instrument he had seen in that photo only moments before. It was scorched black, and had to be the very instrument which Edgar Brill the elder had been carrying after the Peshtigo horror, almost 130 years ago. Grange lifted the heavy object in both hands, turning it to scrutinize its bizarre detail. The thing didn't seem to be of metal, or even wood. Seemed more grown than carved. It had a segmented, bony appearance, like the straightened spinal column of some animal. He set the instrument back down, paged through the journal. Grange was further convinced of Brill's senility, perhaps even insanity, by entries like, "Last night summoned the messenger. Heard his howling from the swamp. Martin, being closer to the swamp, must have had a restless night. Ha!" And later, "Martin sent a letter, the usual ranting, that the great faceless messenger is too close to the world of men, sometimes moving amongst us as one of us, and draws the curious too close to knowledge of those who wait outside, that his works and movements are not truly in the best interest of those outsiders. He again threatens to bring his God against me, to stop my communion with N. He is a fool to think that he would survive such an onslaught himself. One cannot predict or control the fire vampires beyond a certain point, and N and his servitors will let no harm come to me." Grange wagged his head, closed the journal. With his obsession with fire, it was not surprising that Brill had immolated himself. But now to go talk to the brother, and see if he was just as crazy. As he began to descend from the attic, Grange thought he heard music, a kind of faint, high piping, coming from downstairs. He quickened his pace, oddly conscious of the gun holstered under his jacket. By the time he had reached the ground floor, the distant music was fading away. He cracked the cellar door, peered down into damp-smelling blackness, flicked the switch at the head of the stairs. It didn't work. Had the music truly seemed to have come from down here, when he reached the ground floor? No, he decided. It had to have come from outside, a kid practicing on a flute or recorder, or a radio somewhere. The house was as still as a tomb. Grange shut the basement door. Before leaving, he decided to avail himself of Brill's bathroom. He found it, opened the lid of the toilet with the toe of his shoe, and began to unzip his fly, but paused at a soft hissing sound, as if something were being dragged across the floor of the bathtub. Swinging around, Grange tore aside the mildew-blackened curtain. He saw the thing for only 2 instants, before it was whipped down the drain of the bathtub. A black eel or snake it must have been. Grange was badly startled and clawed at his holster, but the slithering thing was gone before he even had the snap off. Yes, it had to have been a snake, though he had not seen its head already in the drain, black with a lighter belly. But that the belly had been covered in greyish-pink discs like suckers was surely an illusion. By the time Grange's car turned onto Pine Street and began crawling along it in search of the house of Martin Brill, evening had begun to fall. Grange remembered trick-or-treating along this row of old houses as a boy in the early 60s, remembered the delightful terror of having Eastborough Swamp looming vast, deep and dark on the opposite side of the street. "Quicksand in there," the parents said, "coyotes, and snapping turtles large enough to take your hand off." He had once found a tiny baby, at least, and carried it into the swamp a short ways to set it free, it hissing at him all the while. He glanced now at the thickly massed trees, blackly silhouetted with the summer sun sunk behind them, in between glancing at the houses in an effort to determine which might be Brill's. He wasn't listed in the phone book. Might Grange have accepted candy from him as a boy? People had indeed disappeared into the swamp a number of times, their remains never found. There had also been talk of ghosts in the swamp over the years, distant lights drifting through the trees, and in the back of Pine Grove Cemetery, which also bordered the swamp, reports of ball lightning flitting about. Will-o'-the-wisps, people called them, or jack-o'-lanterns, and the Welsh had dubbed them corpse candles. Grange had read up on the phenomenon one time, after hearing a variety of local reports. Swamp gas, that was all, he was told, but in some of the cases reported, as in many he read, the ball lightning seemed to move as if an intelligence directed it, as if it might be some ethereal but living creature. The detective was eliminating houses by reading mailboxes, observing toys and new vans in driveways, when the large Victorian caught his eye. Hulking, badly in need of paint, an obsolete TV antenna lying on its side like a giant insect poised on the roof, a tall chimney tottering dangerously, the lawn a miniature jungle, every window black. It was the twin of Edgar Brill's house, right down to the obviously sizable third-story attic. Grange pulled into the driveway. If there was a car, it was shut up in the garage. For a moment he sat in his own vehicle, staring up through the windshield at a three-eyed bay window projecting from that third story, as if he were reluctant, afraid for some reason, to leave his enclosing shelter. But then he cracked the door and stepped out into the doorway. He had gone only a few steps when his car radio squawked, calling to him specifically, and he went back to answer it. "Yeah, Grange," he said, leaning half inside. The dispatcher told the detective that he had been asked to return to the hospital where Edgar Brill had been admitted. "The patient just passed away, suddenly," the dispatcher related. Suddenly, thought Grange. Hardly. He would have been surprised to see the poor eccentric old-timer last a week. And what good could he do there, now that there was nothing else to glean from the man? But he had been requested by the Worcester police themselves, and they must want to know how far he had gotten in the investigation on his end. Grange told the dispatcher he was on his way. As he slipped back into the car, he glanced up again through the windshield at the dilapidated old edifice. Martin Brill would just have to wait a bit longer to learn of his brother's fate. And from what Grange had learned thus far, he might not even care. Grange started his car, but hesitated in backing out, for he had heard a sound underneath the awakening of his engine. He thrust his head out the open window and shut the motor off. Had it really been a distant sound, like a flute playing, coming from the dense woods of Eastborough Swamp? For nearly a minute he listened, but the sound did not resume, just the whirring music of summer insects. Dismissing the notion as his own imagination, he again started the car, and this time backed out onto Pine Street, headed off for Worcester. When Grange turned into the hall and saw the nurse crying outside Edgar Brill's room, a quivering hand clamped over her mouth, and two Worcester cops soothing her, he knew that Brill's death hadn't been quite so expected after all. And the smell. And was there really a slight smoky haze in the air of the hallway? Seeing him approach, one of the two uniformed boys hurried breathlessly forward to meet him. "You better come see this," he said as he came. "What happened?" "We're not sure. The doctors don't know. We think maybe Brill set himself on fire again somehow, but it was almost like the fire was never entirely out, still smouldering away inside him until it just erupted again. But you better see for yourself." Grange continued down the corridor and halted in the threshold of Brill's room. It was close enough for him. The walls were black with a greasy soot, though the sheets of the bed Brill lay in were barely scorched. Brill himself was another matter. A blackened stick figure, a mere skeleton crusted in peeling ash, his empty eye sockets still curling tendrils of smoke, his arms bent and reaching into the air above him like two denuded branches. In his midsection, revealed by the sheets Brill must have kicked off in his agony, there was a gaping, smoking pit. Grange took a step back into the hall, twisting to face the nurse. "What did you see?" he asked her. I was in his room, but my back was turned, only for a second." Her voice kept hitching and she paused to suck back a sob. "I heard this whomp and saw a flash, and when I turned around he was screaming, moving, and this weird fire was coming out of his belly." Grange nodded impassively, but inside he gave a shudder. He had once heard it said in the past, if a body were not embalmed, a puncture would sometimes be made in it, and the leaking gases ignited to burn them away. The nurse went on. "Then the fire, it like rose up out of him, like a ball floating over his bed. Then it just kind of exploded. There was a loud bang, but that was all. It was gone." Grange continued nodding, remembering as he did so his research on swamp gas, how alike this story was to so many cases of ball lightning, often so weirdly sentient in their movements, and frequently disappearing with a loud report. And he thought again of the house of Martin Brill, facing on to Eastborough Swamp, where so many ghostly lights had been witnessed over the years. When Detective Grange had no success in getting Martin Brill to come to his door, he assumed the old man was hard of hearing, or had gone to bed. After all, night had now fallen. He kept looking over his shoulder at the woods, but they remained solidly black. But the next day, when Brill again did not reply to his loud knocking, he called into the station and received permission from the chief himself to enter the premises to check on the old man's welfare. After all, there was no surviving family member to give consent or objection. Grange found the front and back doors locked, but was able to dislodge a screen window on the ground floor, and through that slipped into a gloomy living room, thick with dust and stillness and silence. "Mr. Brill?" he called, and his eyes roved across the shelves, heavy with books older than Brill himself, across the strange photographs, paintings, and astronomical charts mounted on the walls. He saw a staircase in the room beyond, went to it, called up into the murk. "Mr. Brill?" Grange ascended the loudly complaining stairs. On the second floor, no one. But he found another set of stairs, narrower, proceeding on into the attic. He mounted them, slowly. His heart seemed to be thumping from all his climbing. "Mr. Brill?" In the room, just off the stairs, he found him. The elderly man sat in a chair before a bay window, the central window of which was open, the dusty curtains stirring in a welcome breeze. There were odd geometric patterns drawn on the white painted walls. Star charts? If so, only one star in them had been labelled, if that were indeed the meaning of the word Fomalhaut. Martin Brill was dead. His eyes bulged hideously in a face turned almost black, but not from burning. The man had apparently been strangled, for around his neck there were terrible marks, and in the midst of this bruising there were raw, abraded, circular scars in double rows, as if suckers had pressed into his flesh. Grange shifted his gaze past the slumped, staring figure, out to the shadowed fringe of Eastborough Swamp, upon which the bay windows faced. He waited to see a ghostly light moving through the trees, waited to hear distant, frenzied piping. But there was neither. The brothers Brill were dead, and the trees of Eastborough Swamp merely whispered to him with mocking secrecy in the new, cool breeze.